Take a quiet moment for yourself and let your breathing settle into a steady, natural rhythm. For a while, allow the constant mental noise to fade into the background and gently turn your awareness inward toward what has been quietly building beneath everything you've been thinking and doing. There may have been a strange sensation showing up recently, something subtle but difficult to ignore. A sudden tightness in your chest that appears without warning. An unexpected memory of a certain person that surfaces out of nowhere. A restless, almost electric energy moving just beneath the surface of your everyday life. It doesn't feel fully logical, yet it keeps returning. That experience is not meaningless. It is not just imagination drifting through your mind. It is more like a signal your inner awareness is picking up before your conscious thoughts can fully interpret it. Something is shifting in the emotional space connected to this person, and a deeper part of you is already responding to it. Your inner system doesn't rely only on logic or spoken words. It processes subtle emotional information long before it becomes clear on the surface. That is why, even without obvious signs, you can sometimes feel that something between you and someone else is changing. That quiet pull in your chest, the one you may have tried to dismiss, is often your deeper awareness registering that this connection is still unresolved on an emotional level. If that pressure or pull has been showing up, it's worth simply noticing it instead of pushing it away. In many cases, this kind of inner tension appears right before something begins to shift externally. It feels like an invisible build-up, a quiet emotional charge that hasn't yet taken form in the physical world, and that is the space you may be sensing right now. What once felt closed off or distant is not necessarily as fixed as it seemed. Subtle openings can begin forming where there was only silence before. Emotional distance that once felt permanent can slowly start to loosen without any direct action from either side. Your place in this person's inner world may not have disappeared the way fear sometimes suggests. While you were focused on your own experiences and trying to make sense of uncertainty, something was also unfolding on their side, quietly and internally. The emotional walls they built, out of caution, pride, or self-protection, did not remain unchanged. Over time, even strong defenses begin to soften when they are constantly challenged by emotion, and what begins to surface underneath is often more complicated than simple indifference. This is where internal conflict starts to grow. On the outside, they may still appear composed, distracted, or emotionally distant. Their routine continues, life moves forward, and it can seem like nothing has changed. But appearances often conceal a much deeper reality. Beneath that surface, there can be ongoing inner tension, moments of reflection that don't fully resolve, thoughts that return even when they are unwanted, attempts to rationalize distance, to justify space, to convince themselves that stepping away was necessary or safer. Yet emotions don't always stay aligned with logic. When a connection has depth, it does not simply disappear because it is ignored. Sometimes the more it is suppressed, the more clearly it begins to reveal itself internally. Over time, what they once used as emotional protection can start to feel restrictive. The version of themselves that relied on distance and control may no longer feel as stable as it once did. And in that quiet shift, something begins to change in how they perceive both you and themselves. Life can start to feel slightly different in their absence of you, not always dramatically, but in a subtle sense of something missing that cannot be easily replaced or explained. That absence begins to take on meaning. Attempts to stay distracted may still continue. Staying busy, engaging with others, filling time with noise and routine, all of it can temporarily soften awareness. But even within distraction, certain thoughts tend to return in quiet moments, not always loudly, but consistently enough to be noticed. Over time, this creates an internal turning point. The emotional weight of avoidance grows harder to maintain. What once felt like control begins to feel more like exhaustion. And when that happens, inner honesty slowly starts to surface again. The belief that distance would weaken the connection often does not hold in the way people expect. Instead of fading, deeper emotions tend to clarify over time. Silence does not always erase meaning. It sometimes reveals it more clearly. And in that unfolding clarity, something important begins to shift again, quietly, beneath the surface. Instead of fading, your presence has become even more active in their inner world. You show up in their quiet moments, in the pauses before sleep, and in those random gaps during the day when everything goes still for a second. Even in busy surroundings where noise and distraction should take over, their mind still drifts back to you. And if you are sensing this shift too, it is not without reason. Something subtle but real has started to change in the emotional space between you. A deeper recognition has slowly taken shape within them. What they once treated as something they could overlook or move past is now being seen differently. They have begun to understand that what existed between you was not ordinary. It reached parts of them that were not easily touched by anyone else. Once that realization settles in, it changes everything. Because when a connection is finally recognized as meaningful, it cannot be reduced back to something small again. Even when the mind tries to argue or resist, the emotional truth becomes louder than logic. There have been moments, especially in the stillness of night, when they find themselves replaying things they thought were forgotten. Conversations that may no longer stand out in your memory still remain vivid for them. Small, ordinary moments have taken on new weight. The way you responded when things were difficult. The calm presence you brought without trying. The ease they felt simply being around you without needing to perform or pretend. That kind of emotional safety is not common, and once someone has experienced it, the absence of it is not easily ignored. They may have tried to replace it, distract themselves, or convince themselves it was not as significant as it felt, but none of it has fully worked. The more they looked elsewhere, the clearer it became what they were actually missing. At first, pride stepped in to protect them. It told them they could move on easily, that they were unaffected, that they were stronger than their emotions. But pride only works for so long. Eventually, it runs into something deeper and more honest. And for them, that moment has already started to arrive. They are beginning to see this connection in a different light now. Not as something temporary, and not as something easily replaced, but as something that left a lasting imprint on them. Meeting you did not just pass through their life, it changed something inside them in a way that does not fully reverse. And while all of this has been unfolding within them, something important has also been shifting within you. Even if you still think about them from time to time, you are not in the same emotional place you once were. Something in you has become more grounded, more aware, more self-contained. You have learned what it feels like to reach towards someone who is not meeting you halfway. You have felt what it is like to carry more emotional weight than you should have had to carry alone. And slowly, through silence and emotional exhaustion, you began pulling your energy back. That shift matters more than it may seem at first. Because when you stop overextending yourself, when you stop waiting in the same way, the entire emotional dynamic begins to change. There was a time when your attention naturally flowed outward, when your mood, your thoughts, even your sense of stability were influenced by their response. But over time, that pattern started to break, not through anger or dramatic decisions, but through a quiet realization. Your peace cannot keep depending on someone else's inconsistency. So your energy began returning to you, not because you stopped caring, but because you started including yourself in that care, and that single internal shift changes everything. When someone is always emotionally reaching outward, their presence becomes something assumed, something taken for granted. But when that energy becomes centered, calm, and self-contained, its absence is felt very differently. That is what they are beginning to sense now. Not just your physical or emotional distance, but the change in your availability, your attention, your emotional reach. You are no longer showing up in the same way you used to, and that absence creates awareness. Instead of weakening the connection, it has forced a deeper confrontation with what has been avoided for a long time. This is where restlessness begins to surface, a quiet recognition that something has shifted. That you are not the same emotionally available version of yourself they once knew. And that realization creates urgency, not because anything is being chased, but because something is no longer guaranteed. People often do not recognize the value of emotional presence until they begin to experience its absence fully. And now they are sitting with that understanding in a very direct way. Every delay, every avoidance, every moment where fear was chosen over honesty, it all becomes clearer in hindsight when there is no longer the same access to you. And in that clarity, separation reveals something important. It does not always end a connection. Sometimes it exposes exactly what the connection was built on in the first place. It shows where fear was controlling decisions, where emotional avoidance was being disguised as certainty, and where genuine attachment was never fully expressed. At the same time, it also reveals something about you. This distance has not only created awareness in them, it has brought you back to yourself. It has helped you reconnect with your own value, independent of whether they acknowledge it or not. And that is why what you are sensing now carries so much weight. What was once pushed down through avoidance is now gradually surfacing. They are starting to realize that what they miss is not just your attention, but something much deeper: your presence, your emotional depth, and the way being around you made them feel understood without having to explain every layer of themselves. That realization is no longer something they can easily set aside. It has grown into something steady, something that moves quietly through their everyday life rather than appearing only in rare moments. Even during normal routines, their mind can suddenly drift back to you without warning. A sound, a word, a familiar time of day, or even a passing sensation can unexpectedly bring you into focus. At first, these experiences felt unsettling to them. They believed their thoughts and emotions were something they could manage and control at will, choosing when to think about you and when to shut it down. But emotional truth does not operate through control. The more meaningful the connection, the more naturally it returns on its own. Now they are reaching a point where resisting what they feel requires more effort than simply acknowledging it. The inner walls they once relied on for protection are beginning to feel less like safety and more like separation. What once seemed like emotional distance is now being experienced as a kind of inner heaviness. And in that quiet space, reflection becomes unavoidable. They begin to remember things differently than before. Moments where you tried to understand them while they remained guarded. The patience you showed. The emotional presence you offered without demanding anything in return. Things they once overlooked now stand out with a clarity they did not have at the time. This shift changes the meaning of those memories entirely. Because real emotional connection often feels simple while it is happening. Its depth only becomes fully visible in its absence. And now, in hindsight, they are starting to recognize the rarity of what was actually there, your stability, your honesty, and the ease of simply being yourself around you without pressure or performance. They may have tried, at different points, to convince themselves to move forward completely. But even in those attempts, thoughts of you would quietly return. Efforts to suppress the connection did not erase it. They intensified awareness of it. Instead of fading, the bond kept resurfacing in new and unexpected ways. This is not because of confusion, but because something in them genuinely registered the connection as meaningful. And what is deeply recognized internally does not disappear just because it is ignored externally. It continues to exist beneath the surface, shaping how they interpret everything else. At the same time, they are becoming aware of something else, the change in you. Even if not spoken about directly, they can sense that you are no longer in the same emotional position you once were. You are more grounded, more centered, less emotionally reactive, and less dependent on their responses to feel steady within yourself. And paradoxically, that shift in you has not weakened their awareness, it has strengthened it, because when someone stops reaching outward and begins to return to themselves, their energy changes. It becomes calmer, more contained, less scattered, and in that calmness, it becomes more noticeable, not less. Now they are left sitting with their thoughts more directly, without distraction or emotional noise to dilute them. And in that space, everything they once avoided becomes harder to ignore. Their mind keeps returning to you, not in passing, but in a consistent, persistent way that they can no longer fully dismiss. Emotionally, detachment is no longer as effortless as it once seemed. What is becoming clear to them is that your presence in their life created a deeper imprint than they were prepared to acknowledge at the time. And that recognition is beginning to change how they understand attachment, closeness, and emotional truth itself. For someone who has long relied on control and emotional distance as a form of protection, this realization can feel destabilizing. Because once feelings are fully acknowledged, they also bring vulnerability, the possibility of loss, exposure, and emotional uncertainty. Fear has influenced many of their choices for a long time. Fear of being hurt, fear of losing control, fear of being fully seen. But fear has limits, and eventually it becomes heavier to maintain than honesty. That is the stage they are slowly moving into now. The silence between you is no longer experienced as emptiness. It has become emotionally charged. Each day of distance adds more internal pressure rather than easing it. Each attempt to suppress what they feel only makes it more present within them. And that is why the shift you may be sensing feels so noticeable. Something inside them is beginning to reorganize, not as a forced decision, but as a natural emotional unfolding, a quiet internal awakening that gradually changes how they understand you, themselves, and what real connection actually means. They are starting to understand something deeper now, that losing you would not just mean losing a person, but losing a part of themselves that only existed within this connection. And once that kind of awareness begins to form, it creates an internal shift that cannot be easily reversed, even if it is not expressed outwardly. Still, their heart is moving toward a place where silence can no longer fully hold everything in place. The more they try to maintain distance, the more strongly your absence is felt. What was once a way to feel safe is now becoming something that intensifies awareness instead of reducing it. And in that space, an inner conflict begins to grow, between the need for protection and the pull toward reconnection. They begin to imagine conversations that never happened. They replay different outcomes in their mind. They wonder what would happen if they reached out, or whether too much time has already passed for anything to feel the same again. These thoughts do not stay occasional anymore. They begin to return more often, with more emotional weight behind them. What once felt easy to set aside now feels more urgent, more emotionally present, and harder to ignore. There are moments when they come very close to breaking the silence, moments when the pressure inside builds so strongly that reaching out almost feels inevitable. But in those final seconds, fear still steps in and holds them back. Fear has been their long-standing form of protection, a way to stay in control, a way to avoid emotional risk. But over time, even fear starts to weaken when it is repeatedly challenged by emotional truth, and slowly its influence begins to fade. The part of them that once relied on distance is no longer as strong as it used to be. Beneath all their resistance, something clear is already forming within them. They recognize that no one else has reached them the way you have. No one else has created that same depth of emotional recognition, that same sense of being understood, and that recognition changes how everything is felt internally. What once felt uncertain now feels meaningful. What was once pushed away now feels impossible to fully erase. And what was once questioned is becoming clearer with each passing day. Because clarity does not remain still, it creates movement. Emotional change is not always visible on the surface, but internally, something important is shifting. The emotional distance that once existed between avoidance and feeling is no longer as wide as it used to be. At some point, they are no longer standing outside of what they feel, trying to decide whether to enter it. They are already inside it, experiencing it, living it quietly even if unspoken. And once that threshold is crossed, silence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Both of you have changed through this distance. The emotional imbalance that once shaped the connection cannot remain exactly the same. Something more honest is trying to surface now, whether it is ready or not. All the silence, reflection, and inner pressure has created a point where emotional movement becomes more likely than emotional stillness. Because truth, when it reaches a certain depth, does not stay buried indefinitely. It eventually finds a way to express itself. And inside them, something has already reached its limit. The place where holding everything in no longer feels sustainable. What once felt like safety is beginning to feel like distance. And what once felt like control is slowly turning into emotional weight. The separation that was meant to protect them now feels heavier than honesty itself. This is often the stage just before change begins to show itself outwardly. For a long time, they believed that avoidance would make the connection fade, that time and distance would slowly weaken what they felt. But instead, every attempt to disconnect has only revealed how deeply rooted this bond actually is. Meeting you did not just pass through their life, it changed how they experience connection itself. And once that realization settles in, it becomes impossible to return to who they were before in the same way. This is what emotional awakening looks like when it happens slowly. They begin to understand that the peace they were searching for was never in running away, but in finally facing what they feel. There are still fears to overcome, still habits to break, still truths to accept, but something fundamental has already shifted. Now there are moments when the urge to reach out becomes almost impossible to ignore. It rises quietly at first, then builds into something heavier, something that sits in the background of everything they do. Ordinary situations suddenly carry emotional weight. A pause in the day, a familiar sound, a random thought that leads back to you without effort. In those moments, conversations are imagined in full detail. What would be said, how it would sound, how it might feel to finally break the silence. Different outcomes are replayed again and again, as if the mind is trying to find a version of events that feels safest to step into. Possibilities are reconsidered, revised, and emotionally tested. And fear is still there, but it is no longer in complete control. It does not disappear, but it no longer dominates every thought the way it once did. Instead, it competes with something stronger, emotional truth that keeps returning no matter how often it is pushed away. This is where a real turning point begins to form, even if nothing visible has changed yet, because what is happening is not just about reaching out or staying silent. It is about an internal shift that cannot be easily reversed once it begins. Something underneath the surface is reorganizing itself, slowly, quietly, but permanently. And yet the most important realization in all of this is not only about them, it is about you. Because at the exact same time all of this is unfolding within them, something has also been changing within you. The moment you stopped chasing and started returning to your own center, the emotional structure between you shifted completely. Not through words, not through confrontation, but through energy changing direction. What once flowed outward in constant search began flowing inward into self-awareness. That shift created clarity where there was once confusion. It created space where there was once emotional overload. And most importantly, it made absence visible in a way it was not before. When you were constantly reaching, your presence was assumed. But when you stepped back into yourself, your absence became noticeable and emotionally real. In that space, something essential became clear. You are no longer abandoning yourself for the sake of being chosen, understood, or validated. You are no longer making your own worth dependent on someone else's response. And that single realization quietly changes everything that follows. So now, what you are sensing beneath the silence is not imagination, it is awareness. It is the recognition that both sides of this connection are no longer where they used to be. You are witnessing two people moving through internal change at the same time. One is slowly learning to stop running from what they feel. The other is learning to stand fully within themselves without losing their center. And whatever unfolds next, it will not come from confusion anymore. It will come from a very different foundation, not desperation, not avoidance, but something far more grounded. Truth that is finally strong enough to be acknowledged without fear, but truth finally becoming strong enough to be felt. In the end, this is not just about whether someone reaches out or stays silent. It is about what both people are being brought face to face with during that silence. Distance has not erased the connection. It has revealed it. It has stripped away distraction, pride, and avoidance, leaving only truth underneath. One person is learning that emotional honesty can no longer be postponed forever. The other is learning that love cannot come at the cost of abandoning themselves. And that is the real turning point. Because when a connection is real, time does not simply weaken it, it exposes what was always unspoken. It shows where fear was leading decisions and where genuine feeling was never fully expressed. But the most important shift is this. You are no longer waiting in the same way you once were. You are no longer reaching from emptiness or depending on silence to define your worth. You have already begun returning to yourself, and that changes the entire emotional equation. So whatever happens next, let it come from clarity, not anxiety, from wholeness, not longing. Because in truth, this story was never only about who comes back. It has always been about who you become while they are gone.